Now I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Curt Collier. Curt is one of the 3 leaders here at the New York Society for Ethical Culture, and before coming to the New York Society, for 10 years he was the leader of the Riverdale Youngers Ethical Society. He is also the Deputy Director of Groundwork Hudson Valley, and Groundwork is an organization that works with urban youth and gets them plugged into nature and the environment. Curt will address us today on Dictators, Moonies, and Fundamentalists. Does Korea have an authoritarian problem? Curt Collier.
Monica and Dan and a number of you, raise your hand if you went and worked on the Fire Island cleanup. There you go, see there, so they actually worked with me on the project that you raised the funds for. We had a lovely day there out there on Fire Island, also, and it was just fantastic. So Dan was there, so yeah, I put up with his humor and it worked well. So I have to say, you know, watching the news recently, thinking about Korea, and what was almost once again this heightened little drama that we seem to go through every single once in a while with Korea. And it just always seems to get a little worse somehow, and the rhetoric gets ramped up a little bit more. I mean, the silliness of it is, of course, is that for them to do some kind of strike, of course, would lead to some kind of their total annihilation. But also, they would annihilate South Korea and take them out. I mean, when my brother was stationed there as a Ranger in the Marine Corps, that's one of the things that he kept emphasizing is their capability of launching scores of rockets. I mean, Seoul is so close to the Korean border, to the North Korean border. It just takes a second for the bombs to rain down by the thousands, which they have rained. So it's really, once again, we listen to this drama, and how long we've been hearing about North Korea, and every once in a while we do this. And I decided to put some thoughts together about it and to think about it. Now, the reason why I got interested in Korea is actually because of my dad. Yesterday was my dad's, what Jewish people call the yard site, so his 1 year of passing. And when Dad was a young man, he left Dolphin Island, Alabama. So he was living on this island off the coast of Mobile, Alabama, living on an island that did not have electricity, and they were all fishermen. My father was born actually in Pascagoula, Mississippi, in the living room of the house, probably like some of you may have been born outside of a hospital. He then got, his father worked as a dredge boat operator. He was gone quite a bit, so he just spent most of his time out on Dolphin Island, basically working with the seafood industry and helping the family out there, while his dad was dredging channels. And then he went to go work for his dad, and while he was working for his dad, my father got drafted into the Army. Well, in those days, you didn't really want to do that, because so he immediately ran down and went into the Navy, because first of all, he liked being around water, boats, just couldn't see himself being in the Army. And then he went to San Diego, California, went through the induction there, met my mother. She was 13. He proposed 2 years later. So it shows you where he was from in Dolphin Island, Mississippi. It's a totally different world. He said, well, his thing is, usually they don't wait that long, but they don't. So then he got shipped off to Korea to go fight in the Korean conflict, they call it the Korean War. So as you can imagine, coming from where he went to there, what a shock that must have been. And so my father did not have very flattering stories about Korea, which he more or less inculcated into me as a kid, and told these stories over and over again about what it was like there and how scary it was and for him, and all the problems, of course, and the desperation of what was the Korean people at that time, and you know, during this brutal war that just dragged on, killed 77,000 Americans. It was a pretty major event. Did some of you in the Korean War? Since it's Memorial Day, yes, sir. So I would hear all these stories as a kid, and of course I formed an opinion about Korea pretty early on. And he was there for his entire period in the Navy. He was in Korea, and only in the last few months did he go to this new thing that was starting up in Vietnam, and then got out of the military. The second time I heard about Korea is when my older brother got stationed there. there. My brother Robert was a pilot in the Navy, ended up in Korea, basically flying constantly with us with AWAC kind of thing, this type of Navy plane that has a giant surveillance. And his stories of Korea were different from my father's. He thought the people were pretty friendly, and he thought it was a pretty interesting place, but his whole fascination, he's not a city guy, my older brother, as none of us are, and he basically just talked more or less about what a pretty place he thought Korea was. How many of you have been to Korea? It's absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it is a very, very, very beautiful place. There's mountains and parks, and it's a gorgeous place. And so he talked a lot about it. Well, his stories, of course, were kind of in direct conflict with what my father had told me for years. And I found it very, very interesting that his talk about Korea was so different. When I was a young man, my father kind of helped run an aircraft rebuilding company. My father was one of the chief inspectors, basically, there. And a bunch of Korean businessmen came over to our house to try and think about using that company my father was working with to restore their airplanes. And we're living in South Texas with a town of 4,000 people at that time. We moved to a smaller town. There wasn't a lot of Korean businessmen coming through our little town. Needless to say, I was overly fascinated by anybody different, of course. Thought that was just fascinating. And the men were quite nice, didn't speak too much English, that was the only problem, but brought some nice gifts and gave them to my parents. And I thought they were kind of neat people. They seemed very nice, very polite, certainly different than the stories my father had told. The third time I heard about Korea from a family member was when my second brother was stationed there. And he was a major in the Marine Corps, and he spent the most time in Korea. So my father, my older brother, and my other brother all were stationed in Korea. We joke that after Mexico, Korea is the most place that the Colliers have ever lived. And it is funny when you think about it, what an impact that one culture had on a military family such as mine, and on some of your other military families. And what was fascinating for my brother is had a totally different perspective. He took his wife and children there, 2 young kids, lived on the military base. In fact, as a souvenir, I still carry around my military ID from when I came in there and spent an entire couple of months living in Korea, somewhere here. I carry that with me, my military ID. And his experience was completely different. My brother adapts to anything, and him it was about going to the restaurants and going shopping and driving in Korea, which is a unique experience if any of you have ever been there. But his experience was just, I got to get the family around, we got to go to schools, we're going to go to sports. They did a lot of shopping, a lot of touring. And his description of Korea before I went there, of course, was of a completely different country once again. Needless to say, from my father telling the same stories over and over and over and over again for years, my middle brother to my other brother, I saw this big change in household stories about Korea. And then I went there, and I got to spend several months there. What a gorgeous place, first of all. You fly into the Incheon airport there, and it's one of the most beautiful airports in the world. Gorgeous. You're coming in these low bay, there's all these little islands, and you're looking down there, and just such a beautiful place. And then when you get there, of course, the thing about Koreans, which my family loves, they have a lot of parks. You can go hiking everywhere, and you go hiking up this mountain, and the Koreans are big hikers, so you go and the trails are filled with people, and you get to the top of this mountain somewhere, and then there's a cave, and you go in there, there's a little Buddhist guy who hands you a medal or something like that. It was great. The other thing that fascinated me was the modern subway system they had. And I was already living in New York, which is one of the oldest subways in the world, and went to one of the most modern, and it was so clean, it was so nice, so efficient. But the most fascinating thing is how the Koreans treated my father. Now, Koreans have a tremendous respect for former military men who come back to Korea. And everywhere my parents went, they were hounded by adoring fans in a way, who did everything for them. We would step into a subway, and immediately a bunch of just, typical young teenagers kind of stuff would get up and ask my father, beg my father to sit down. We were out hiking one time, and it just started to rain a little bit. This woman chased us down and made sure my father carried an umbrella. And he was totally embarrassed by all that stuff. But for me, it was fascinating watching my father, who had these very old, different stories of Korea, the things I had, and looking at this completely modern, gorgeous country. I mean, Seoul looks like New York City. I mean, it's just big top skyscrapers, and everything's completely modern. The youth are completely modern. You know, it's fashion in the high. You know, look at Opum Gangnam Style. You know, how many of you, Psy had this song for you don't know. There's a Korean young man who created a song called Opum Gangnam Style. It's about a section like that. He's making fun of like the Hollywood or the Beverly Hills section of Korea, of Seoul. And so he's like dressing like them, and it's actually a mockery song. And it became an internet sensation. It's sung in Korea. And it's such a big thing that you see it everywhere. And all the politicians did it until it came out that he had actually said some very mean things about the United States. Then he kind of embarrassed the Obama administration because he had invited him to the White House because it really became like an international figure. And basically Psy apologized profusely, saying, "You don't understand. I was caught up in it. You know, I definitely apologize. We love Americans," and kind of apologize. Would help a little bit. So anyway, you go into Korea now. You see this perfectly modern country. You could go anywhere feeling totally, absolutely safe. I mean, it's a really amazing thing. Just get on any bus, any subway. We were at a restaurant, and we did something that typical of Americans. We left a tip on the table, and then went off, and we were kind of just shopping in this place. And this woman comes rushing back to us with almost tears in her eyes, saying, "You left this money. You know, here's your money back." We're like, "No, it's for you." And like, she's like, "What am I supposed to do with it? You already paid for the food." Modern restaurants, it's just a lovely place. Like I said, you've been there, right? You go many times?
No, just one.
Just one time. So it's a gorgeous, gorgeous place. And then we go up to Panmunjom, right? Panmunjom is where the 38th parallel runs through there. And it's like the weirdest thing in your life. You gotta do this trip. Once in your life, you gotta go to Panmunjom because, first of all, you're getting close to the North Korean border. Panmunjom is the place where they get together for the two sides to talk. And really what it is imagine this is the border, and it's heavily fortified. I mean, they say it's one of the most dangerous places in the world because there are landmines everywhere else. And you go into this military bank, and they tell you, do not say anything to the North Koreans, don't do anything to provoke them. You go through this whole thing, and then you go to this place, and there's a room, and the room has a red line, I think it was red, across the middle of it, and part of the table is North Korea and part of the table is South Korea. And what they do is they shut the door, and then you can go and you can walk into North Korea, and then walk around and and that's it. The South Koreans, Republic of Korea, the Rock, they call themselves, standing like this, looking extremely fierce with these reflective sunshades on, so they look they're staring at the North. And the North is sitting there watching them with telescopes, looking vaguely uninterested. But it's just surreal because the North Koreans had built this whole Hollywood set of a city, and they show us. You go on this tour, the military tour, and they stop and they say, look at this beautiful city the North Koreans have built, and it's supposed to look like a model city. But they say, look harder, and you can see that they're nothing more than facades with stakes in the back holding up the building fronts. And you're going, surely they know we can see that that's a fake city. It's so bizarre. Have anyone been in North Korea? So you know it's pretty strange when people go there. It's really hard for people in the West to appreciate practically anything going on there. Because also we hear of what a brutal dictatorship it is. I mean, if you piss off the North Korean government, they don't just arrest you, they arrest your children and they arrest your grandparents, and you all end up in prison, right? And you all live out the rest of your lives there. And there's this story of a young man who finally escaped, and he escaped, didn't know about it. He actually turned in his own mother and his brother and watched them get assassinated, had almost no feelings about it. It came out later that he said, actually, I turned them in because they had broke the rules and I didn't want to get in trouble. I mean, that's just how he was raised in there. He thought people were born with guns in their hand, and that's just the way the world is. And of course, there is this thing we always have to deal with the fact that the North Koreans are starving to death. That literally they do not have enough food, and they are just dying still. There's been massive famines where they've lost millions, it seems like. It's so funny when you go, the the South Koreans finally figured out that the North Koreans were tunneling underneath there into Korea. And so the South Koreans, of course, the South Koreans blocked the north part of the tunnel. And then what you do is you go inside this tunnel to see what it's like. And my brother says, yes, it's very, this is where they could bring their armies out, and they were going to use these tunnels to sneak in and suddenly invade into Korea. Seoul is only a few miles away, practically. And so I'm looking at this cave, and I'm thinking, yeah, they all come running out, and they're all this tall. Because the tunnel is only, you're like walking down this thing, you're like, what could they possibly fit through that? And then you realize that, they're just starving to death. So here's the thing. We have this country that we dearly love, the South Koreans who dearly loves us, and these kind of strange things that go on there. And I've always wondered, since I was a young man, who are these people and how do they feel about us and what happened there? When you think about it, to understand kind of their reaction to the world, it's important to know a little bit about Korean history. Koreans, of course, like most of Asia and like most of Europe, went through an extremely brutal feudalist period, of course. The kings and the kind of stuff, the petty kingdoms fighting each other. The problem for the Koreans is that every time they went and fought each other, it weakened them. As you can imagine, they had these little feudal states waging these brutal little wars, like the shogunates in Japan had a very similar thing. And every time that happened, some foreign power tried to exploit that. So in the 1300s, for example, the Mongols came in after one period. They finally succeeded in pushing those out. And then the Japanese came the first time in the 1500s and burned everything to the ground. Just basically destroyed everything because the Japanese wanted the Koreans to support them in a war against China. The Koreans refused to do so. So when the Japanese came in 1592, not only did they destroy everything, but they took all of the cultural artifacts, took a bunch of the women, of course, as they did during World War II, to be basically as sex slaves. And then, of course, took all the intellectuals back to Korea. In fact, for a long time, it was that if you really wanted, in Japan, if you wanted a really good tutor, you would have a Korean who you captured in there. So they finally end up pushing out the Japanese and reclaiming their countries when the Manchurians invaded, the Chinese invaded. And for the same reason, that was in 1619. As soon as they pushed them up, the French and the Dutch began to arrive. And just like we did with Admiral Perry, we went to Korea and we said, you need to open up your ports for us. But then Korea said, we don't have enough of foreigners, we don't want anybody. Same thing that Japan said. And of course our reaction is basically saying, like, do this or we're going to destroy you. Korea also became a hermit kingdom. It shut its doors down and for a long period of time did not have anyone coming into the country that was not a Korean national. In the 1890s, they had a famous peasant rebellion, excuse my Korean, Donghuk, peasant rebellion, and in which basically a group of Koreans said, enough of this oppressive regime that we have. We're going to have a humanist rebellion so we can bring equality to humanity. The Korean government at that time became so fearful of these peasants who were pushing for the same kind of rights that were now going on around the world that they asked the Chinese to send some troops. The Chinese sent 2,000 troops into Korea, and that upset the Japanese, who then launched the Japo-Sino World War, and then had a war in 1894. So basically, they were fighting over who was going to control Korea for a long time. Then Russia decides it needs a warm water port. The north part of northern Korea is half China and half Russia. And Russia, of course, just has Vladivostok, and it's just a really, really cool place like Alaska. And they need a warm water port, so they began to fight, of course, to try and get control of both Manchuria and in Korea, which led to the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, which Japanese finally won. The Japanese at that point then annexed Korea, and from 1910 to end of World War II, basically the Japanese controlled Korea. Now, when the Japanese controlled Korea, they forbid Hangul, they forbid the language from being spoken. They tried to rid the kids of all Korean culture and tried as hard as they can to push them out. Right? So it was a really, really bad experience for the Koreans. When you go visit Korea, they still have really hard feelings about all the things that happened to them, all the people who were taken from Korea who worked as slaves in Japan, and it is a big point of contention that Japan has never fully recognized the fact that what it did to Korea. Right? Then World War II came, and as part of that agreement, when the liberation of Korea, we gave the northern part to the Russians and we took the southern part, right? Just like we did in Germany. And that was divided at the 38th parallel. That was supposed to have been a temporary relationship, but once the Russians got into the area, of course, they had a different view. But it didn't work out in their favor as well, though, because a certain amount of Korean nationalism came back in the north, they decided to do their own form of communism, and they basically pushed out the Russians. So that's, in a nutshell, how they felt in their experience. It is a tale of invasions, of cultural annihilation, of forced slaveries, of invading armies over and over and over again. And it creates a spirit in Korea that permeates the culture today. And the culture that permeates it, the idea, the central idea of Koreans, is the same one that resonates a great deal with us. They want self-determination. They want to control their own place. Right? So whether you're north or south, self-determination is a central theme. Now, self-determination is one of our central themes as Americans as well. Right? About being free from the British, taxation without representation, all that kind of stuff. And also through our religious beliefs, the right that we would not have a priest over top of us, that everyone was free to think that we want. It's the Alexis de Tocqueville coming to America, coining the word individualism in the 1800s, early 1800s, 1823, somewhere in there, to say that we are our own self-determined people. That thinking exists within Korea as well. So it's odd when you put it into perspective, they're more like us than we even would like to admit sometimes, because of that self-determination. However, where we differ is to what extent self-determination means. For us, self-determination extends all the way to the individual. I am in charge of everything that I make the decision for. I can make my own decisions about what I think, what I believe, what's good for me, and what I want. Right? For them, self-determination stopped at the Korean people. One step kind of ahead of us. Right? Part of that belief of self-determination in the United States is because of antinomianism. That's that $10 word. I always tell the story, every time I drive up the Hutchinson Parkway, Ann Hutchinson, I remember her. I drive it every day. And there's this sign, Ann Hutchinson. I was looking for it. There it is, Ann Hutchinson, the day she was born, the day she died in White Plains, New York. And of course, she was raised in Boston, and she's living in this Calvinist belief that each one of us is to be priest unto ourselves, that we should have our own beliefs. But what she differed was, here was the church saying, okay, we're all going to be good Christians, then this is how you should live, and only us should be in charge, meaning the Christian believers and the saved. And Anne says, well, if I'm supposed to believe that for myself, why do I even trust you, government? Why can't I just be free from all of that? In 1600, she came with this idea called antinomianism in theology. And it had a profound effect on Americans. The belief that not only do we freely believe like we do, but that is sense in a way of limited government, and that they are not the moral dictators and be able to tell us what they're doing. Right? They have limitations of what they can do. Ann Hutchinson preached this all over New England. It became an extremely popular belief system. People like Emerson wrote a lot about it. And of course, she was killed in White Plains. Later on, he wrote about it. And of course, she was killed in White Plains by Native Americans because she got pushed out of New England. And there's Korea has a certain different belief, right? So they also have this belief in self-determination, but they are also heavily influenced by Confucian, right? Confuci, Master Kong, all right, which we get the Portuguese version of that word Confucius. Confucianism basically said that there needs to be order and stability, that each of you need to be self-actualized, that each of you needs to study, to empower yourself and cultivate the best that's within you. Right? That's the heart of Confucianism, which is the reason why Arthur Dobrin, the leader from Long Island, liked it so much. But also that if a king is in charge, if they're not a good king, you can get rid of them. And you replace them with someone who is a good king and a good leader. But Confucianism also has a slightly different belief in Koreans when they took it on, that we must follow the person ahead of us who was put in charge, right? As long as we're doing your job, if you're just a benevolent despot, it's okay if I follow you as long as you're doing what you need to do, right? Ultimately, if you do it wrong, you can get rid of that person. But there is this notion of hierarchy and this very, very strong notion of authoritarianism. When you go to Korea, they take you to all these beautiful temples and things like that. And a lot of them are Buddhist, of course, and some of them are Confucian. And what you did is you had to take an exam. Think about this in the 1500s, right? You take an exam, and if you were really, really good, you became a kind of a petty bureaucrat, and you were put in charge of certain kinds of things. And it was a very, very difficult job. In China, everybody could take that exam, which is that kind of what's the joke now? The dragon moms who push their kids to exceed really hard in school. There was that kind of thing because in China, anyone could take that exam, anyone could actually rise out of their station in life and achieve much more. That was not so much true in Korea, which created a problem. So we both have these kind of notions of self-determination, but there's a difference between us as the individual and them as the country. Right? So that's the difference. It gets us into trouble whenever we try and do something collectively. Look at gun rights, right? We try and do something collectively for the nation, and what pisses off Americans is not just gun rights, but that you're telling me what to do with my gun. It's the same thing when I do with environmentalists. I go to people and I say, really, you got this piece of land that's really, really great. I really don't want you to sell that marshland to developers. You really should keep it as a marsh. And then there's these giant fights that, who are you to tell me what to do with my land? And that's typical of the kind of problems with our self-determination we have in America. But the problem they have in Korea is one of authoritarianism. So it's kind of the same things from two different ways. I'll show you three quick examples. One is the North Korean quasi-religious belief of Juche. Kim Jong-il is the one who, of course, really kind of pushed this through. And it operates almost kind of a religion in North Korea. It's this notion of self-determination. It's one of the things that they aspire to. And it's expressed three ways. That because of their oppression for centuries, they want political independence. They want to be able to make decisions for themselves and not other people telling them what to do. You can hear the fight that we have with the North Koreans when we tell them you can't do these kinds of things. Right? The first thing is they say, well, our religion, our Juche, the thing we want is to make decisions for ourselves without anybody else, I don't care if it is the world community or not, telling us what to do. The second thing they want is economic independence. It was called socialism in one country. It's like a form of Stalinism. That the country itself should be economically stable itself, enough so that it doesn't need to rely on other nations. The problem with that is you're just too small. Right? We need, if you're into capitalism, you know that you need a world connection. They try it. Every time they try and do it within one country, where you just buy from your own products and you create your own products and you manufacture your own products and create this economy, it fails. Because that's how capitalism just can't work that way. And it's odd when you think about the North Koreans really pushed for that, and yet they're so heavily dependent, first of all, on the Soviets for a long time for economic aid. They just couldn't make it work. Burma's tried to do the same thing, right? Myanmar, that was their idea, is that they got this notion from North Korea in a way that they wanted their total self-independence. But Burma was just not big enough, nor had the economy enough to make it work. So they wanted political independence, they wanted economic independence, and they want self-reliance in defense. They want to be able to stop armies from marching once again across Korea and to control everything. Those three beliefs, which have to do with self-determination, are elevated almost to the point of a religion in North Korea. That's what they did. That's the difference between the North and the South, is the North, they mix it with some communist ideas about self-determination, the rise of the proletariat, getting rid of the bourgeois, all that stuff, which Kim Jong-il just rewrote. It said, really, no, it's about political independence, economic independence, and self-defense. Those three are the periods. And if you listen to what they say, when they rant and rave and say all these things, those are the 3 points they talk about. Those are the 3 things they keep coming back. Now, it wasn't just in North Korea that you had this kind of a belief that, in those kind of notions. The South has the very same thing. And the South went through an extreme period also, from the 1960s almost to the 1990s, of where almost economic dictatorship. Think about it. When Korea, in 1960, the yearly per capita income in 1960 was $103 a year in Korea. $103. That's what they lived on. That's my father's experience coming in the 50s. Right? Extremely poor country. In the 1993s, they were making $7,500 annually, and now they're making $30,000 annually. So since 1960 to today, in a relatively short period of time, they have been in an economic powerhouse. I mean, think of how many products you have in your house that are made in Korea. And there's a large number of them that you probably didn't even realize. But they did that by a couple of very strong men, one named Park Chung-hee and then Chung Du-hwan, who basically came through and said, I'm going to tell you how to run your business for the good of this country. One of my favorite economists is a guy named Han Jun-chang. He wrote 2 really fun books to read. One is Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. He's from Korea. He's now at Cambridge University as one of their main economists. And he wrote a book called Bad Samaritans. And I just want to tell you, kind of reflecting what I just said, a paragraph that I found in here when I was reading through this. He says, Koreans, my own people, are probably the world champions at being more Catholic than the Pope. Not quite in this little sense, only around 10% of them are Catholics. Korea is not exactly a small country. The combined population of North and South Koreans, which for nearly a millennium until 1945 used to be one country, is about 70 million people. But it happens to be bang in the middle of the zone where the interests of the big giants, China, Japan, Russia, and the US, clash. So we have become very adept at adopting the ideology of one of the big boys and being more orthodox about it than he is. When we do communism up in North Korea, we are more communist than the Russians. When we are practiced Japanese-style state capitalism in the South, between the 1960s and the 1980s, which we talk about, we were more state capitalist than the Japanese. Now we have switched over to US-style capitalism. We lecture the Americans on the virtues of free trade and shame them for deregulating financial labor markets left, right, and center. And it's true. So they become extremes about all this kind of stuff, and they've learned to take everything good that they learned around the world, and then 1 or 2 people made an entire economic decision and pushed, luckily, Korea into the modern state that it is. That doesn't always work, but it's worked in 2 big places, China and Korea. Right? Now, the third thing, of course, that has risen with enormous speed is Christianity. Now, Christians have been in Korea for a very, very long period of time. We sent Christian missionaries, meaning the West, sent Christian missionaries to Korea starting in the 1700s. The idea is that if we could convert them, they would be more friendly to France and Europe and England and all this kind of stuff, who wanted economic interest. Nobody had a foothold there. Japan was shut down. The Dowager of China was trying to protect them, all this kind of stuff, until the Boxer Rebellion, and the British figured out how to get everybody hooked on opium. Everybody was trying to get into Asia, correct? And there was no way to get into Korea. So we started sending missionaries, of course, that if people converted to that religion, they'd be more like us, shall we say. And they took it on quite well. Part of that is because the Koreans have a kind of a mindset called Han. And I don't pronounce that word right, but I first heard about it from a Korean priest when I was working in my doctorate. He said Han is the feeling you get, and we don't have a word for it in English, of just being depressed and despairing because you're always being oppressed. So if you're always being an oppressed person, you develop this feeling of kind of worthlessness of Han. And what Christianity, he said, did as a Catholic priest was give them a sense of their own dignity, right? Their own sense of worth. Think about it, it was not long after the Korean missionaries started going in there that you had that rebellion that I talked about in which they were trying to be themselves. Women were completely off the grid in Korea. I mean, a woman had absolutely no rights. She was forced into marriages. She couldn't really have any control of her own life. It was pretty harsh. And then the Christian missionaries came in and said, stop that. You can't have multiple marriages. Women have the same rights as men. And it was revolutionary to them. So Christianity begins to creep in first with Catholicism and then with Protestantism. In fact, Anglicans did really, really well in Korea because of the British. But it wasn't until Christian fundamentalists came in that it really started to take off. For example, Presbyterians. Every Presbyterian church now in this area, if you look, has a service in Korea. It's because Presbyterianism is such a big thing in Korea. Now, what's interesting, though, about that is the religion that they chose, the fundamentalism that they chose in Korea, is so different, some Christians say, from what the type of Christianity they wish were flourishing there. There was a really great book that came out in the 80s, some of you may have read, from Bruce Bauer called Stealing Jesus, How Fundamentalism Betrays Christianity. And it was about the fundamentalist rise in our own country. And they said there's two kinds of Christianity. There's Jesusianity, right, which is focusing on love and taking care of your neighbors and being wonderful and forgiving, and that's it, right? And then there's this belief from Paul, which is Paulianity, that you have to do certain things. It's very legalistic. It's about redemption and all these other kind of stuff. And there's a struggle between those two. And unfortunately, the legalists are losing out in this country. Up until just recently, now we see the demise of even their kinds of beliefs. But in Korea, of course, this made total sense, right? And so for them, a lot of the religion that they're taking on is that I'm going to be a member of this religion, but ultimately I am accountable because of these rules to this religion. Think of the remnant church that meets downstairs. Not to pick on them, but they're a good example of something that I have a problem with. And the problem with them is their notion of accountability, which is written into their belief system also, right? That ultimately, if you're a member of the remnant church, you have to show submission to someone of a higher authority, right? There are some Korean churches where you're not allowed to get married, change your job, or do anything without going to the church elders. And there's a problem with that, right? We have a problem with that. New religions in Korea, such as Moonism, is another good example. Reverend Sung Myung Moon, of course, remember the big rage about that. He, in the 1930s, Jesus came and spoke to him and said, I didn't fulfill my mission because they killed me on the cross, and basically you need to fulfill it. So he decided to do that. And one of the things that we were supposed to do, of course, is to fulfill the family. And that Jesus never got a chance to marry. Same thing that, to a certain extent, the Mormons say. And so, because of that, Myung Sung Moon got married, of course, to the second wife. And that was going to be a celestial marriage. And they would become the true parents, and they would tell the rest of their followers how to live their lives, right? It's basically Christianity with a strong kind of emphasis on authoritarianism. And so much so that even till recently they have these mass marriages, where they marry thousands of people over here in Central Park and all this kind of stuff. And they try to pull those together. My fear about Korea is the same fear, which I actually love the country, is the same fear I have about the United States. How we play with self-determination. And what does it really mean? What are the limits of it? We struggle with that. I, as an environmentalist, struggle with that all the time, between the rights of the landowner and the rights of nature to continue on, between the rights of us as a nation to forbid guns from blowing children away constantly and the rights of the Constitution for people to bear arms and things like that. That is our kind of problem. But the problem that they have in Korea is also about this, they don't have that sense to the extent that we wish they would, because we're a different culture, of them being able to say, I don't need to listen to an authority. And so when we speak to the Koreans, we speak to them in a very wrong way. We don't speak to where we connect. And that's what we should do. We focus on the three things for which they argue. We say you need to open up your economic system. That's not what they're interested to do. We say that we need to lower their defenses and get rid of that, which is also about their self-determination that they're not going to do. Ooh, 1 second. And that they need to be a part of the world community, the political independence, which is also not what they're interested in doing. But it's not in the North that you just see that. You also see that in the rapid takeover of fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism in the South. So much so that now the Koreans are having a hard time with Buddhist Buddhist temples being destroyed by Christian fundamentalists. They're trying to obliterate their Buddhist history as much as they possibly can. And they're open about it. They openly speak that that's a good thing to get rid of this pagan religion, which was feudalism to them because it came from China to a certain extent. But also just that there's only one right way to believe and one thing to think about. So when we talk to them, we need to think of a new way to talk to them. And I leave you with this Korean parable about how that might happen. It's a Korean folk tale about Hangbu and Nobu. And Hangbu and Nobu were brothers. Hangbu the older, Nobu the younger. The father, on his deathbed, brings the two sons in and says to them, when I die, I want you to split my wealth. Right? This is a popular Korean folk tale read every night by parents to their children. Then the father dies, but Hangbu, being the older brother, takes all the wealth for himself. Nobu then is forced off the land and goes off with his wife to live in poverty. The younger son, Nobu, is walking in a garden, thinking of his lot, but trying to make the best of it, when he sees a snake crawling up a tree, trying to get to a swallow's nest. And right when the snake attacks the swallow, Nobu climbs up, grabs the snake, beats him up, and chases him away. He then sees that the sparrow has a broken leg. So Nobu puts a little tiny splint on the bird, heals the bird back together, and then the bird flies away. The next spring, the bird returns on the windowsill of Nobu's house and has a seed in his mouth and points to him to plant the seed. Nobu plants the seed and a gourd plant comes up. And when he opens up the gourd, it's full of jewels and riches. Suddenly, the older brother, Hangbu, hears about this and says, how did he do that? And he goes to his brother, and his brother tells him, here's what happened. There was a sparrow, and I helped him out, and I fixed his little leg, and he brought back this magic seed, and I planted it, and I got all these jewels. So Hangbu goes to a sparrow's nest, takes the sparrow, breaks its leg, then puts splints back on it, and sends it away. Sure enough, the following spring, though, the bird flies back and lands with the seed and points for Hangbu to plant it. Hangbu then plants the seed into the ground, and once he plants the seed, the gourd begins to spread out. But when they break open the gourds, instead of finding jewels, all these thieves come out who steal everything that he has and leave him and his wife penniless. Now, in Americans, when they hear that story, of course, we think that all good acts deserve, and being good and being caring, of course, is the point of the stories, and that bad things will bring you bad luck. But the way the Koreans emphasize the story is slightly different. It's not just that Hangbu did a wrong thing. What Hangbu did is he didn't think about his brother also. And he had a responsibility to do the right thing for his brother rather than sending him off into poverty. That is the major kind of emphasis of the story. If we can speak to our dear friends in Korea about anything, it's about the responsibility of those in power to think just like that Confucian tale says, not just about themselves and the power that they're trying to garnishing together for their own wealth and own benefits, but what responsibility they have to those lesser than to themselves. And I think that's the kind of conversation that any one of us can have with them. Thank you.